May 1943, Tachikawa Airfield, west of Tokyo, Japan. Major Kazuyuki Saito's hands moved slowly across the B-17E's fuselage, his fingers tracing the thick armor plating behind the pilot's seat. This makes no sense. No bomber should carry this much weight. The American bomber sat on the Tachikawa tarmac like a captured giant. Its olive-drab paint faded from months of tropical sun in Java before Japanese engineers had salvaged it and flown it home. Serial number 41-2471. The aircraft that would force Japanese military thinking to confront an uncomfortable truth. The fortress measured 64 feet from nose to tail, its wings spanning 103 feet 9 inches across the concrete. 4 Wright Cyclone engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, hung from those wings like promises of American industrial power. But what captured Major Saito's attention, what would revolutionize Japanese understanding of American bomber doctrine, was not what the B-17 could do. It was what the B-17 chose to carry at the expense of performance. Weight devoted entirely to keeping American crews alive. Major Saito commanded the technical evaluation team at the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force's Air Technical Research Institute. He had examined dozens of captured Allied aircraft, British Hurricanes, Dutch Brewster Buffaloes, American P-40 Warhawks. Nothing had prepared him for this moment. This bomber, painstakingly rebuilt from wreckage found at Yogyakarta in Java, would expose a design philosophy so fundamentally different from Japanese military thinking that it would take years for analysts to fully comprehend its implications. The mathematics of this discovery would demonstrate why American bombers could absorb punishment that would destroy their Japanese counterparts. Every assumption Japanese engineers held about bomber design, about the acceptable trade-offs between protection and performance, about the value military forces should place on crew survival, was about to be systematically challenged by the evidence contained within this single American aircraft. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The journey to this moment had begun 18 months earlier on December 8, 1941. That morning, as smoke still rose from Pearl Harbor, American forces in the Philippines prepared for the inevitable Japanese attack. At Clark Field, the primary American airbase north of Manila, rows of Boeing B-17 bombers sat exposed on the concrete. The newest models recently arrived to reinforce American air power in Southeast Asia. The oldest versions, C and D models that Boeing and the Army Air Corps considered suitable only for training purposes. The Japanese attack arrived at 12:35 in the afternoon. 82 G-4M bombers and 26 older G-3M bombers crossed from Formosa, their formation perfect, their altitude 20,000 feet, beyond the reach of American anti-aircraft guns. The Americans had been expecting the attack since dawn, but confusion, communication failures, and the sheer surprise of Pearl Harbor's devastation had left most American fighters on the ground when the Japanese formation appeared. The bombers struck with devastating precision. In 45 minutes, American air power in the Philippines had been effectively eliminated. Of 17 B-17 flying fortresses on the ground, 12 were destroyed outright. Nearly every P-40 Warhawk fighter was reduced to burning wreckage, but several B-17 seconds survived, damaged but repairable. These aircraft would fly sporadic missions against Japanese forces before being withdrawn south to Java as Japanese conquest of the Philippines became inevitable. In March 1942, Japanese forces captured Madioen Field in Java. There, Japanese army engineers from the Koku Gijutsu, Kenkyuyo discovered multiple B-17 wrecks in repairable condition. One B-17E bomber, serial number 41-2471, had crash-landed at Yogyakarta on February 8 after sustaining battle damage. The crew had abandoned the aircraft, believing it beyond salvage. Japanese engineers assessed the wreckage differently. The bomber's nose section was damaged, its engines removed by retreating American forces, but the airframe remained largely intact. The wings were solid. The control surfaces are functional. Using parts salvaged from other crashed B-17 seconds scattered across Java's airfields, Japanese technicians began the painstaking work of reconstruction. They were assisted, remarkably, by captured Allied mechanics, who possessed the technical knowledge necessary to properly reassemble American aircraft systems. By early 1943, 2 B-17Es had been rebuilt to flying condition. The logistics of returning them to Japan required elaborate planning. The aircraft flew from Java to Singapore, then northward through carefully plotted routes. A fighter squadron provided escort. A Nakajima L-2D transport, the Japanese license-built version of the Douglas DC-3, served as mothership, carrying spare parts and navigation equipment. Every air defense installation along the route received advance notice. The sight of American bombers flying with Japanese escorts could easily trigger friendly fire. The journey required multiple days, but in May or June of 1943, the captured B-17Es reached Tachikawa Airfield near Tokyo. The aircraft that American crews had abandoned in Java had become Japan's window into American bomber design philosophy. Major Saito assembled his evaluation team. Lieutenant Shioyama would oversee systems testing. Second Lieutenants Kurusu and Ohara would examine weapons systems. Army engineer Shimamura would lead structural analysis. Major Uno and Captain Yagi, experienced test pilots, would conduct flight evaluations. Army engineer Kaneko would disassemble and study every component of the Wright Cyclone engines. The examination began with the exterior. Japanese engineers circled the B-17, notebooks in hand, measuring and photographing every detail. The aircraft's size impressed them. Japan's most capable bomber, the G-4M Betty, measured 19.63 meters from nose to tail. The B-17 stretched 19.46 meters, nearly identical in length, but the resemblance ended with dimensions. The B-17's construction was fundamentally different. Where Japanese bombers used the thinnest aluminum sheeting possible to save weight, the B-17's skin felt thick, almost heavy under their hands. Tapping the fuselage produced a solid sound, not the hollow ring familiar from Japanese aircraft. The wings, examined through inspection panels, revealed multiple fuel tanks constructed with elaborate rubber compound bladders. Self-sealing tanks. Technological Japanese engineers understood theoretically, but had deliberately omitted from their own bombers. Major Saito climbed through the forward hatch into the bomber's interior. The contrast with Japanese bomber design became immediately apparent. Armor plating everywhere. Behind the pilot's seat, a thick steel plate curved to deflect bullets and shell fragments. Around the cockpit, additional armor protected both pilots from frontal attacks. The navigator's position featured armored bulkheads. Even the radio operator's compartment included protective steel plating. The top turret, equipped with two .50 caliber machine guns, sat behind armored glass. The waist gunner positions featured armor plating and armored windows. The ball turret beneath the fuselage, while offering minimal protection by necessity of its design, still included a small armor plate behind the gunner's seat. The tail gunner sat behind the heaviest armor concentration, protected from the rear hemisphere, where Japanese fighters typically attacked. Saito examined the windscreen. Armored glass, thick panels designed to stop machine gun bullets. He tapped it with his knuckles. Solid. Heavy. The Americans had chosen to add perhaps 30 to 40 kilograms of armored glass just to protect the pilot's forward vision. He moved to the wings, opening inspection panels to examine the fuel system. Each wing contained 3 main fuel tanks, constructed with self-sealing rubber bladders. Later production B-17Fs and all B-17Gs included additional Tokyo tanks, 18 removable self-sealing cells installed inside the wings, adding 1,080 gallons of protected fuel capacity. The bomber could optionally carry 820 additional gallons in auxiliary tanks mounted in the bomb bay. Every fuel tank featured the same construction: aluminum inner shell, thick rubber bladder compound between layers. When punctured by bullets or shell fragments, the rubber compound swelled, automatically sealing small holes. Larger damage required the fuel tank to be isolated, but small perforations, the most common combat damage, would seal themselves within seconds. Saito calculated the weight. The self-sealing compound alone added several hundred kilograms. Combined with armor plating throughout the aircraft, the Americans had deliberately accepted over 1,000 kilograms of additional weight that reduced speed, decreased range, diminished bomb load, weight devoted entirely to crew protection. He examined the engine installations. Each Wright R-182097 Cyclone radial produced 1,200 horsepower, driving three-bladed Hamilton Standard constant-speed propellers. The engines incorporated sophisticated fire suppression systems, carbon dioxide bottles connected to each nacelle. If fire broke out, the crew could flood the engine compartment with CO2, extinguishing flames before they could spread to fuel tanks. The propellers included feathering mechanisms, allowing crews to stop windmilling propellers after engine failure. Unfeathered propellers created enormous drag, making flight difficult with multiple engine failures. The B-17 system allowed pilots to feather dead engines, maintaining better control and improved performance on remaining engines. Saito moved to the bomb bay. The Americans had designed an internal bay, unusual for the era when many bombers carried ordnance externally. The B-17 could carry up to 4,000 pounds of bombs internally, protected from wind resistance until release. The bomb bay doors, he noticed, were well engineered. They opened quickly, minimized drag when opened, and closed securely. The bomber's defensive armament exceeded anything Japanese engineers had seen on comparable aircraft. 1350 caliber M2 Browning machine guns in 9 positions, 2 guns in the chin turret beneath the nose, 2 guns on nose-cheek mounts, 2 staggered waist guns, 2 guns in the upper Sperry turret, 2 guns in the Sperry ball turret below the fuselage, 2 guns in the tail turret, 1 gun firing upward from the radio compartment. Each gun position included sophisticated computing gun sights, especially the Sperry automatic computing gun sight that calculated lead angles automatically. Japanese bombers typically mounted lighter 7.7mm machine guns, with perhaps one 20mm cannon in the tail. The Americans had chosen to mount weapons nearly twice the caliber, in nearly twice the numbers, at significant weight penalty. The oxygen system revealed another American priority. 4 separate oxygen systems with 16 outlets, plus walk-around bottles for crew movement within the aircraft. Total capacity of 72 man-hours. High-altitude operations required oxygen, but the B-17 system was overbuilt by Japanese standards, redundant and heavy. Lieutenant Shioyama examined the heating system. American bombers operated at altitudes where temperatures reached -40 degrees Celsius. The B-17 included comprehensive heating for the entire crew, with provisions for heated flight suits. Japanese bombers operating at similar altitudes expected crews to endure the cold with minimal heating systems. Major Uno and Captain Yagi conducted the first test flight in late June or early July 1943. The B-17 flew differently than any Japanese bomber. Heavier, more stable, less responsive to control inputs. The extra weight created inertia that required American pilots to plan maneuvers in advance. But that same weight provided stability in turbulence and combat conditions. Maximum speed disappointed Japanese observers. The captured B-17E achieved approximately 287 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Japan's G-4M Betty bomber reached 265 miles per hour at comparable altitudes. The Americans had accepted only marginally better speed despite much larger engines. Range proved even more revealing. The B-17E, fully loaded with standard fuel, achieved approximately 2,000 miles of combat radius. The G-4M Betty could fly missions exceeding 3,000 miles. The American bomber, despite larger size and more powerful engines, flew significantly shorter distances. Bomb load capacity offered the only clear American advantage. The B-17 could carry 8,000 pounds maximum overload, though typical missions used 4,000 to 5,000 pound loads. The Betty carried 1,764 pounds standard, with maximum capacity under 2,200 pounds. American bombers could deliver 2 to 3 times the ordnance. Major Saito compiled his preliminary findings. The B-17 represented design priorities, fundamentally opposite to Japanese bomber development, where Japanese engineers maximized range, speed, and offensive payload by minimizing weight. American engineers had deliberately accepted reduced performance to maximize crew protection and survivability. The weight allocation told the story. Approximately 1,000 kilograms devoted to armor plating, several hundred kilograms in self-sealing fuel tanks, additional weight in redundant systems, fire suppression, sophisticated defensive armament. The Americans had chosen to build bombers that brought crews home alive, even if those bombers flew slower, shorter distances, and carried marginally more ordnance. In August 1942, Asahi Press published articles examining the captured B-17 seconds. Mitsubishi engineer Hisanojo Ozawa, designer of two Japanese twin-engine bombers, including the Ki-21 and Ki-67, wrote with barely concealed amazement about the American design philosophy. The American engineers have perfected the subsystems of this bomber to such a degree that a minimum of controls are needed in the cockpit. This feature aids in-flight control simplification and allows the pilot to turn his attention to other tasks that can be critical in combat situations. Shizuo Kikuhara, designer of the Kawanishi H-8K flying boat, focused on the cockpit ergonomics. The B-17's instruments were arranged logically, controls positioned for easy access, systems designed for simplicity under combat stress. Japanese bombers, by contrast, often featured cramped cockpits with instruments scattered across multiple panels. But the armor and self-sealing tanks troubled Japanese observers. Torao Saito, an aviation editor from Asahi Press who toured Java's captured bases, noted in his report that the maintenance facilities for the B-17 were excellent. It appeared that Bandung Field was the main maintenance base for the Americans, and it was here that our technicians from the Giken performed their initial flight evaluation tests on these newest of American warbirds. In February 1943, Asahi Press published a comprehensive book titled Anatomy of the Enemy's Aircraft, featuring extensive photographs of captured Allied aircraft, with special attention devoted to the B-17 seconds, both D and E models. Nearly every major component appeared in photos and drawings. Since Japanese engineers also possessed complete instruction manuals for the aircraft captured when American forces abandoned their bases, no detail was overlooked. The Tokyo magazine Koku Asahi devoted almost an entire issue in May 1943 to the captured B-17 seconds. Japanese engineers, military planners, and aircraft designers pored over the photographs and technical specifications. The American bomber's design philosophy was laid bare in meticulous detail, yet the extensive evaluations appear to have had remarkably little impact on Japanese bomber design. Japan's aviation industry faced constraints that American industry did not. Limited aluminum supplies, restricted access to high-grade materials, constrained manufacturing capacity. Most critically, fundamentally different strategic assumptions about how the Pacific War would unfold. The contrast between American and Japanese bomber philosophy traced back to decisions made years before Pearl Harbor. In September 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy issued specifications to Mitsubishi for a new land-based attack bomber to replace the G-3M Nell. The requirements were unprecedented. Top speed of 398 km per hour, cruising altitude of 3,000 meters, range of 4,722 kilometers without bombs or torpedoes, range of 3,700 kilometers when carrying an 800-kilogram torpedo or equivalent bomb load. These specifications demanded extraordinary performance. The Mitsubishi design team, led by Kiro Honjo, faced an impossible problem. Achieving such range and speed with twin engines required minimizing every gram of weight. There was no margin for armor plating, no capacity for self-sealing fuel tanks, no allowance for crew protection systems. Honjo's team made deliberate choices. They designed the wings as integral fuel tanks, maximizing capacity while minimizing structural weight. They used the thinnest aluminum sheeting that could maintain structural integrity. They eliminated armor entirely. They accepted that the resulting bomber would be vulnerable to enemy fire. But in 1937, when design work began, these trade-offs seemed reasonable. Japanese strategists expected future conflicts to be short and decisive. They anticipated catching enemies by surprise, striking before effective opposition could be organized. They believed that range and speed would provide sufficient protection by allowing bombers to strike beyond enemy fighter radius and return before interception. The G-4M Betty bomber that emerged from these specifications proved devastatingly effective in 1941 and early 1942. The aircraft achieved exactly what its designers intended. It could strike American forces at Clark Field from bases 460 miles away. It could attack Darwin, Australia from bases 1,500 miles distant. It could maintain pressure on Port Moresby from airfields across New Guinea's mountain ranges. It could strike Guadalcanal from Rabaul, over 600 miles away. No American bomber could match this range. B-17 seconds in the Philippines could not reach Japanese bases on Formosa. American bombers lacked the capability to strike Japanese positions from safe distances. The asymmetry gave Japanese forces enormous tactical flexibility. They could attack at will, while Allied forces struggled to retaliate effectively. But the G-4M's advantages depended entirely on limited Allied fighter opposition. When Betty formations could approach targets at high altitude without interception, when they could deliver weapons and depart before fighters arrived, the aircraft was devastatingly effective. These conditions characterized operations during the first 6 months of the war, when Allied air strength remained limited and dispersed. By mid-1942, the tactical picture changed. American fighter strength increased. Wildcats gave way to more capable Hellcats and Corsairs. Pilot training improved. Tactical doctrine evolved. Betty crews began reporting disturbing losses. The unprotected fuel tanks that enabled extraordinary range became death sentences once American fighters achieved interception. American pilots quickly nicknamed the G-4M, the Flying Lighter, or One-Shot Lighter. A single burst from 50 caliber machine guns could ignite the bomber's fuel tanks. The thin aluminum skin provided no protection. The unprotected fuel created vapor that exploded when heated by tracer rounds. Betty bombers burned easily, spectacularly, completely. Japanese aircrews flew knowing their aircraft's vulnerabilities. They understood that any hit to the fuel tanks meant probable death. They accepted this because their culture emphasized mission accomplishment over personal survival. But acceptance did not reduce casualties. By late 1942, Betty formations suffered such devastating losses that missions became suicide operations. Major Saito's examination of the B-17 exposed the fundamental difference between American and Japanese approaches. American engineers had made opposite choices. They accepted reduced range. They accepted a lower speed. They accepted smaller bomb loads. In exchange, they built bombers that could absorb enormous punishment and bring crews home alive. The famous stories of B-17 combat damage became legendary precisely because they were true. On a mission over Tunisia, a B-17F named All-American collided mid-air with a German Bf-109 fighter. The German aircraft struck the bomber's fuselage, cutting through the structure. When the wreckage fell away, All-American was nearly severed in two. Both starboard engines were destroyed. One port engine leaked oil severely. A hole over 4 feet wide and 16 feet long opened the top of the fuselage. The tail section wobbled and twisted during flight. Only one elevator cable remained functional. The tail gunner was trapped in the rear section, unable to crawl forward through the destroyed midsection. Crew members used parachute harnesses and pieces of the German fighter lodged in the wreckage to hold the two sections together. The pilot, Ken Bragg Jr., continued to the target and successfully released his bombs. The return flight required extreme care. Any sharp turn risked tearing the tail section completely free. The bomber flew alone, losing altitude slowly, speed decreasing. The emergency landing covered 70 miles of gradual turning. All-American made a wheels-up belly landing. Not one crew member was injured. When the crew exited through the hole in the fuselage and the tail gunner descended a ladder, the rear section crumpled to the ground. The bomber had completed its mission while nearly cut in half. The armor plating, structural redundancy, and robust engineering that Major Saito documented in his evaluation report had kept the crew alive. Another B-17 named Sweet Pea received a direct flak hit over Debrecen, Hungary, that created a hole in the waist compartment large enough for a jeep to pass through. Every tail control cable except one was destroyed. The pilots maintained control by manipulating engine throttles. The bomber returned to base. The entire crew survived. A third B-17, part of the 388th Bomb Group, took a ground-launched rocket through the No. 3 engine. The missile ricocheted into the fuselage and exploded, leaving the top turret gunner with severe burns. Despite extensive damage to control lines, the pilot brought the bomber down safely at an emergency field. These incidents were not rare exceptions. They were common enough that B-17 crews expected their aircraft to withstand catastrophic damage and continue flying. 8th Air Force statisticians documented that bombers regularly returned with tails shredded, engines destroyed, large portions of wings blown away. The armor, plating and self-sealing, tanks that added 1,000 kilograms of weight proved their value in hundreds of missions. German Luftwaffe officers, after examining wrecked B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds, calculated that on average it required 20 hits with 20mm shells fired from the rear to bring down an American heavy bomber. The armor, redundant systems, and structural strength made American bombers extremely difficult to destroy. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The mathematical reality was brutal. American bombers could absorb damage that would destroy Japanese bombers instantly. A burst that would explode a G-4M. Betty's unprotected fuel tanks would puncture a B-17's self-sealing tanks, which would seal within seconds. A hit that would kill an unprotected Japanese pilot would strike armor plating protecting an American pilot. A shell that would sever unprotected control cables would be stopped by redundant systems in American bombers. The weight penalty that troubled Major Saito, that seemed illogical by Japanese engineering standards, was actually a calculated investment. American industrial capacity permitted building heavier bombers. American factories produced over 12,700 B-17 seconds during the war. Nearly 10,000 B-24 Liberators. American forces could field large numbers of protected bombers without compromising capability. More critically, protected crews survived to fly again. A B-17 crew that survived being shot down could be rescued and returned to duty. A crew that brought a damaged bomber home could fly the next day in a replacement aircraft. American training pipelines produced new pilots continuously, but experienced combat veterans were irreplaceable. Armor and self-sealing tanks kept veterans alive. Japanese doctrine reached different conclusions. The Betty's design reflected calculations that range and striking power outweighed crew survival. This philosophy assumed achieving surprise would provide sufficient protection. It assumed enemy opposition would remain limited. It assumed the war would be short and decisive. Every assumption proved catastrophically wrong. By mid-1942, American fighter strength reached levels that made Betty interception routine. By late 1942, American pilots had learned to exploit every Betty vulnerability. By 1943, Betty formations suffered such devastating losses that missions required crews who accepted probable death. By 1944, Betty bombers could barely operate in daylight against American opposition. The mathematics of Betty's war were written in fire and loss. Every advantage that made the aircraft formidable in early 1942 became irrelevant once sustained combat began. Range meant nothing when bombers exploded before reaching targets. Speed meant nothing when fighters could intercept from distant bases with radar warning. Payload meant nothing when formations were destroyed before weapon release. Major Saito understood these implications as he compiled his final report on the captured B-17. The American bomber represented a design philosophy Japan could not afford to copy. Japanese industrial capacity could not support building 1,000-kilogram heavier bombers. Japanese aluminum supplies could not waste material on armor plating. Japanese production lines could not reduce output to build more protected but heavier aircraft. More fundamentally, copying American design philosophy would require admitting that Japanese strategic assumptions were wrong. It would mean acknowledging that the war would not be short and decisive. It would mean accepting that crew protection mattered more than maximum range. It would mean recognizing that American industrial capacity gave them freedom to make choices Japan could not match. The captured B-17 seconds served multiple purposes beyond technical evaluation. Japanese pilots practiced attack tactics against the American bombers. Training films featured the B-17 seconds demonstrating combat maneuvers. One such film showed Nakajima Ki-43 fighters engaging the bomber. The B-17 painted with restored American markings to appear authentic for propaganda purposes. In the fall of 1943, all three captured fortresses were moved to Fusa Airfield, now the United States Air Force's Yokota Air Base, near Tachikawa. This facility served as the primary testing ground for Japanese Army aircraft. Two B-17 seconds visited Hamamatsu, the main heavy bomber base, in June or July 1944. Their mission there probably involved comparisons with Japanese bomber designs, though specific details remain unclear. American aerial reconnaissance photographed one of the captured B-17 seconds at Tachikawa in May 1945. Intelligence analysts identified what appeared to be a new Japanese four-engine bomber or transport. They estimated the wingspan at approximately 104 feet and designated it Tachikawa Airfield 104. Analysts never suspected the aircraft was actually an American bomber until after the war ended. One B-17E was damaged beyond repair in early 1944 when a crosswind during takeoff caused its wing to collide with a Ki-49 bomber on the ground. The second B-17E disappeared from photographic records, possibly destroyed in a hangar fire at Tokorozawa Airfield. The fate of the third aircraft remains unknown, though it was probably destroyed in Allied bombing raids or scrapped late in the war. The extensive B-17 evaluations yielded technical insights but produced limited practical applications. Japan attempted to develop four-engine bombers partially inspired by American designs. The Nakajima G-8N Renzan, developed after Japan captured B-17 seconds in Southeast Asia, incorporated some American engineering concepts. But the G-8N entered production too late, in conditions too desperate, with materials too scarce to matter. Japanese industry, in 1944 and 1945, faced overwhelming challenges. Aluminum shortages forced use of wood in aircraft construction. Factory bombings by B-29 superfortresses destroyed production capacity. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Pilot losses exceeded replacement rates. Technical knowledge gained from examining captured B-17 seconds could not overcome these catastrophic constraints. The contrast between American and Japanese bomber operations told the larger story. American forces in Europe flew massive daylight bombing campaigns. Formations of hundreds of B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds struck German industrial targets, despite heavy fighter opposition and intense anti-aircraft fire. Losses were significant. 4,735 B-17 seconds were lost in combat, 37% of total production. But the surviving bombers brought most crews home safely. Protected by armor plating and self-sealing tanks, American bombers could sustain damage and continue flying. Crews that survived being shot down were often rescued and returned to duty. The combination of industrial capacity, protective design, and crew survivability created a sustainable bombing campaign that continued for years, systematically destroying German war production. Japanese bomber forces could not sustain comparable operations. Betty bombers conducting long-range strikes suffered losses that quickly depleted available aircraft and experienced crews. Later model G4M2 and G4M3 variants added some armor and fire suppression systems, but these modifications came too late and proved insufficient. The fundamental design philosophy that prioritized range over protection could not be corrected without completely redesigning the aircraft. The ultimate lesson Major Saito's team discovered examining the B-17 was philosophical, not technical. Aircraft design embodies national priorities, industrial capabilities, and strategic assumptions. The B-17 embodied American values, industrial strength that permitted accepting weight penalties, strategic patience that assumed long wars of attrition, cultural emphasis on individual life that prioritized crew survival. The G4M Betty embodied opposite values, limited resources that demanded maximum efficiency, strategic assumptions of short, decisive war, cultural acceptance of sacrifice that deprioritized individual survival for mission success. Neither philosophy was inherently superior. Each made sense within its nation's constraints and assumptions. But when those assumptions proved wrong, when the war became long and attritional, when industrial capacity determined outcomes, the American philosophy proved sustainable, while the Japanese philosophy proved catastrophic. The nation that built bombers to bring crews home developed an air force that could sustain operations indefinitely. The nation that accepted catastrophic casualties for performance advantages destroyed its air power through attrition. In August 1945, two G-4M Betty bombers, painted white with green crosses, carried Japanese surrender delegates from Tokyo to Ie-shima, then to Manila for formal surrender negotiations. The aircraft that opened the war by devastating Clark Field ended the war carrying delegation members who would sign surrender documents. The bombers were escorted by American P-38 Lightning fighters. After landing, both aircraft were destroyed. Japan no longer needed bombers. The captured B-17 seconds at Tachikawa were probably destroyed in the same period, either by American bombing or by Japanese forces clearing bases. Allied occupation forces found no trace of the captured fortresses. The aircraft that revealed American bomber design philosophy to Japanese engineers vanished without record, their technical lessons rendered irrelevant by Japan's defeat. Major Saito's detailed reports remain in Japanese archives, technical documents that chart American bomber capabilities with meticulous precision. Photographs from Koku Asahi magazine, showing captured B-17 seconds flying past Mount Fuji with Japanese military markings, stand as evidence of one of the war's stranger episodes. Enemy bombers pressed into service, examined and tested, ultimately unable to change the trajectory of the conflict. The story of Japanese examination of captured B-17 seconds reveals fundamental questions about military technology, design philosophy, and the relationship between industrial capability and strategic success. When American engineers at Boeing designed the B-17 inches the mid-1930s, they made choices about acceptable trade-offs. They chose protection over maximum performance. They chose crew survivability over extended range. They chose robust construction over weight efficiency. These choices reflected American industrial reality. Factories could produce aircraft in enormous numbers. Training pipelines could generate replacement crews continuously, but experienced combat veterans remained valuable. Keeping them alive justified additional weight. Self-sealing tanks that cost fuel capacity saved lives. Armor plating that reduced speed saved crews. Japanese engineers faced different constraints when designing the G-4M Betty in 1937 and 38. Limited aluminum supplies meant every kilogram mattered. Restricted manufacturing capacity meant simpler, lighter designs produced more aircraft. Strategic assumptions about short, decisive warfare meant immediate striking range mattered more than long-term crew survival. The designers understood the risks. They calculated the weight penalties. They knew protection would enhance survivability. But within their constraints, prioritizing range and speed over protection seemed rational. The resulting bomber achieved extraordinary performance for its era. 6,000-kilometer range with twin engines, speed approaching 430 kilometers per hour. Payload capacity for torpedoes or bombs sufficient to sink capital ships. These capabilities proved decisive in early 1942. Betty bombers sank HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, demonstrating that land-based aircraft could destroy capital ships at sea. They devastated American air forces at Clark Field. They ranged across the Pacific, striking targets beyond Allied retaliation capability. For 6 months, the design philosophy that sacrificed protection for performance appeared vindicated. But sustained combat exposed the fatal flaws. Once American fighter strength increased, once interception became routine, once Betty formations faced prepared defenses, the lack of protection proved catastrophic. Unprotected fuel tanks exploded from single hits. Thin aluminum skin provided no defense against 50-caliber machine guns. Unarmored crews died from wounds that armored American crews survived. The contrast became a matter of mathematics. American bombers could complete missions despite taking substantial damage. Japanese bombers that sustained comparable damage exploded or crashed. American crews that survived being shot down could be rescued and returned to duty. Japanese crews in destroyed bombers usually died. The cumulative effect over years of warfare proved decisive. By 1944, American air power had achieved overwhelming superiority. Thousands of protected bombers flew systematic campaigns against Japanese positions. Japanese bombers, when they could fly at all, faced impossible odds. The Betty formations that once dominated Pacific skies had been reduced to desperate kamikaze missions, crews accepting certain death because their aircraft could no longer survive conventional combat. The examination of captured B-17 seconds provided Japanese engineers with complete technical knowledge of American bomber design. They understood the armor placement. They comprehended the self-sealing fuel tank technology. They recognized the value of redundant systems, robust construction, and comprehensive crew protection. But understanding could not overcome industrial and strategic limitations. Japan lacked the aluminum to build 1,000-kilogram heavier bombers. Manufacturing capacity could not support reduced production rates for more complex aircraft. Most critically, adopting American design philosophy would require acknowledging that fundamental strategic assumptions were wrong. It would mean admitting that the war would not be short and decisive. It would mean recognizing that crew protection mattered more than maximum performance. It would mean accepting that American industrial capacity had provided them advantages Japan could not match. Some Japanese engineers advocated for more protected bomber designs. Late-war variants of the G4M included modest armor and improved fuel tank protection. The G4M3 model, which flew in January 1944, featured self-sealing tanks, crew armor, and better defensive armament. But only 60 were built, far too few to affect combat operations. The modifications came too late, in too small numbers, with too little material support to matter. The philosophical lesson extends beyond World War II into broader questions about technology, strategy, and national priorities. Military technology embodies choices about acceptable trade-offs. Those choices reflect industrial capabilities, strategic assumptions, and cultural values. When assumptions prove correct, design choices appear brilliant. When assumptions prove wrong, the same choices appear catastrophic. American assumptions about the Pacific War proved more accurate than Japanese assumptions. American strategists anticipated long, attritional warfare. They planned for sustained industrial production. They expected fighter opposition to increase. They designed bombers for survivability in sustained combat. These assumptions aligned with eventual reality. Japanese assumptions about short, decisive warfare proved wrong. The strategy of achieving quick victories through surprise attacks succeeded initially but could not be sustained. Once American forces recovered from Pearl Harbor, once industrial production reached full capacity, once the war became attritional, Japanese forces faced opponents with overwhelming material advantages. The bombers each nation built reflected these different strategic frameworks. American bombers were optimized for long wars of attrition, where crew survival enabled sustained operations. Japanese bombers were optimized for short campaigns where maximum range enabled decisive strikes. Neither design was inherently flawed. Each made sense within its strategic context. But when American strategic assumptions proved more accurate than Japanese assumptions, when the war became long and attritional rather than short and decisive, the bomber designs revealed their respective strengths and weaknesses. American bombers sustained operations through years of combat. Japanese bombers suffered unsustainable attrition that destroyed their effectiveness. The captured B-17 at Tachikawa stood as physical evidence of these different approaches. Every armor plate, every self-sealing tank, every redundant system represented American choices about what mattered in bomber design. Major Saito's examination reports documented those choices in meticulous detail. Japanese engineers understood exactly what Americans had built and why, but understanding could not bridge the gap between different strategic realities. Japan in 1943 and 44 could not build aircraft like the B-17. Attempting to copy American design philosophy would have reduced production, consumed scarce materials, and still produced inferior results because Japanese industry lacked American manufacturing capacity. The story ultimately demonstrates that technology alone does not determine military outcomes. The B-17 was not inherently superior to the G-4M Betty as an aircraft. Each bomber excelled at its design mission. The B-17 excelled at surviving combat and bringing crews home. The Betty excelled at reaching distant targets with limited resources. Superior technology in one nation's hands proved decisive, because that technology aligned with accurate strategic assumptions and robust industrial capacity. Had the Pacific War been short and decisive as Japanese planners expected, the Betty's extraordinary range and speed would have proven more valuable than the B-17's protection and survivability. Had American industrial capacity been limited to Japanese levels, building 1,000-kilogram heavier bombers would have meant fielding far fewer aircraft. Strategic context determined which design choices proved successful. The examination of captured B-17 seconds revealed to Japanese engineers exactly what choices American designers had made. It exposed the design philosophy that prioritized crew survival over maximum performance. It demonstrated the industrial capacity that permitted accepting weight penalties for protection. It showed the strategic assumptions that anticipated long, attritional warfare. But revelation did not provide solutions. Japan could examine American bombers in exhaustive detail, understanding every design choice. That knowledge could not overcome limited aluminum supplies, constrained manufacturing capacity, or strategic assumptions that had proven wrong. Technology divorced from supporting industrial and strategic frameworks cannot determine outcomes. The final irony is that Japanese engineers built exactly what their specifications demanded. The G-4M Betty was not poorly designed. It brilliantly achieved the requirements established in 1937. Extraordinary range, exceptional speed, minimal weight. The aircraft performed precisely as intended. The requirements themselves, based on strategic assumptions that proved catastrophically wrong, doomed the design regardless of engineering quality. American engineers also built exactly what their specifications demanded. The B-17 brilliantly achieved requirements established in the mid-1930s for a strategic bomber optimized for crew survivability in sustained combat. The aircraft performed precisely as intended. The requirements themselves, based on strategic assumptions that proved accurate, made the design successful regardless of its weight penalties. Major Saito's team at Tachikawa documented this reality in technical reports that survive in Japanese archives. They understood that American bombers represented fundamentally different design priorities. They recognized the value of armor, plating, and self-sealing tanks. They comprehended that crew protection enabled sustained operations. Their reports made clear that Japanese bomber design philosophy differed fundamentally from American approaches. But their reports could not change Japanese strategic reality. Understanding American design philosophy, even admiring its effectiveness, could not overcome the industrial and strategic constraints that made Japanese bomber design what it was. The captured B-17 stood as evidence of what American industrial capacity and strategic planning had achieved. It could not provide Japan with comparable industrial capacity or strategic advantages. The thousands of Betty bombers lost in combat across the Pacific stand as testimony to the consequences of design choices made years before the war began. Japanese engineers and crews did their best within the constraints they faced. They flew missions knowing their aircraft's vulnerabilities. They accepted risks that American crews did not face. Their courage and skill were never in question. But courage and skill could not overcome fundamental design limitations rooted in strategic assumptions that proved wrong. The Betty bomber destroyed itself through attrition because it was optimized for short, decisive warfare that never materialized. The design that made perfect sense in 1937 became catastrophic by 1943. The B-17, examined so carefully by Major Saito's team at Tachikawa, represented the opposite trajectory. Design choices that seemed to accept unnecessary weight penalties proved essential for sustained combat operations. Protection that reduced performance saved crews who flew again. Armor and self-sealing tanks that diminished range enabled missions that continued for years. In the end, the story of Japanese examination of captured B-17 bombers reveals a profound truth about military technology and strategic planning. Understanding enemy capabilities provides valuable intelligence, but intelligence alone cannot overcome fundamental strategic and industrial limitations. Japan's engineers understood exactly what made American bombers effective. That understanding could not provide Japan with American industrial capacity, strategic advantages, or the ability to correct design choices made years earlier based on assumptions that had proven wrong. The captured B-17 at Tachikawa served its purpose. It revealed American design priorities in exhaustive detail. Japanese engineers learned everything technical examination could teach, but technical knowledge could not bridge the gap between different national capabilities and strategic realities. The bomber that American crews had abandoned in Java became a window into American military thinking, but it could not provide Japan with the industrial strength and strategic advantages that made American thinking successful. Major Saito's final reports documented the obvious conclusion. American bombers were designed to different priorities, built by different industrial capacity, optimized for different strategic assumptions. Japan could not and should not attempt to copy American bomber design. The Japanese industry needed aircraft optimized for Japanese constraints and capabilities. The problem was not bomber design but strategic reality. By 1943, when the captured B-17 seconds arrived at Tachikawa, the strategic situation had already determined the outcome. The examination revealed what the Americans had built. It could not change what Japan could build, or what strategic situation existed. Technical intelligence, however thorough, cannot overcome strategic disadvantages or industrial limitations. The captured B-17 stood as evidence of American advantages Japan could not match, showing clearly why the Pacific War's outcome was becoming inevitable. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.